Hey guys, it's Stuart from Twisted Core here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to recreate the bubble effect that you see behind the Twisted Core website here. So this project might seem rather daunting from a code point of view. I mean, how do you recreate something like smooth animated bubbles in simply CSS and HTML? Well, it's actually quite an easy process. The example itself, there's a lot of code to write for this, but it comes out overall the difficulty isn't too high. Anyone with a reasonable understanding of HTML and CSS can see how it works, understand, maybe implement in your own project. As always, the source code for this project will be in the description. For a walkthrough on how to create this, I'm just going to start just now. We have your blank HTML document here, and we're going to create a UL on this page. We're going to give it class bubbles. Right, and we're just going to fill it with unpopulated leads. Now for this, we're just going to use 5 leads. Now we're using these and we're going to style each one of these to become an individual bubble. We don't need to give them identifiers because you can refer to each Lee in a UL class just by using nth of child. Now for the CSS, we're going to start by addressing the bubbles class. Now there's a couple of things we need to set up for the entire UL list before we start customizing each individual Lee. So we're going to set the bubbles class to an absolute positioning. This means that it's always not going to be affected by the flow of the document. It removes it from the entire flow of the document, so it's not affected by other elements. And this is because we're going to be using the bubbles as a background like we have it on the site. We're also going to make sure there is no pushing from any side of the document. There's no padding or anything, so we're going to set the top and the left to 0. And we also want to set the width of it to 100% so it fills the entire screen. I also want to set the height to it to 100% so it fills the whole screen. Pretty self-explanatory. Now for the z-index, this is what's going to make it appear as a background and sort of out of touch from the other elements, so especially when the bubbles go over other elements in your page, you're not going to be able to interact with the bubbles, they're going to remain background. So I'm going to set their z-index to 0. Now keep in mind, since their z-index is 0, you're going to have to make sure you have a container with your own content in it, and you want to make sure that z-index is set as 1 or anything higher than 0, obviously, so that you can still interact with that after the bubbles have passed over. Now also a little trick for CSS Transformations, you're going to want to add in the CSS tag transform translate z 0. Now this is just a CSS trick for removing a lot of CPU load from when you are interacting with an animation, because lots of the time when you have animations like this constantly going, they can use up a lot of CPU. But the translate z tag means that there's not going to be too much CPU usage because it translates each bubble into its own layer. And as you can see, we're using a very small amount of CPU and GPU here, when before it was using up to 50% of my CPU when it was running the page. So that's all for the bubbles class, and we can then move on to the bubbles and targeting the individual leads. Okay, now when you're targeting the individual leads, this is just going to be a quick setup for how they're going to look. Now obviously we're styling them as squares in this example, and they're all going to be differently sized. And that's what going to achieve the simple bubble effect, or it's at least going to start as these squares across the bottom of the screen. So we're going to set all of the bubbles to have a position absolute. And we're going to make sure the list style is none, because otherwise they're going to have bullet points next to them, which is pretty much useless for our example. We want to make them display as block elements. We don't want them to be displayed in line like a list is normally. And we're going to set, for example, well, in fact, we can leave the widths and stuff until we target each individual Lee, which we'll use with nth of child. So this is just a sort of all-round targeting for each individual Lee. Now we're going to want them all to be the same color, I think. So we're going to set the background color to just an opacity white. Now you can set the background color to anything you like, obviously, but for this example, we're going to be setting an RGBA tag, and we're going to set them as 255, 255, 255, and something very light like a 050. There we go, and that's a very light example. Now we also want to move every single Lee underneath the bottom of the page. Now since the bubbles element is 100% of the page, we're going to want to make sure that we cut underneath the page. Now you set this as a negative amount, but you want to make it the exact same height, or even a bit more of a height than your biggest bubble is going to be. So we'll just say 100 pixels as our amount here, because I don't know if we'll have a bubble more than 100 pixels, or we'll make sure that our biggest one is only 100 pixels. Now, the animation we want to use here, we're just going to call this one the square animation, so we're going to call it animation square, and we'll run it for roughly 20 seconds, and you're going to want to make it infinite so that your animation repeats. Now, the square tag, that's not a standard tag, we're going to set that up with keyframes a bit later, but for now we're going to leave it as square. Okay, so to finish off the styling for the Lee elements, we're going to change the transition timing function. So the tag is just transition timing function, it's the whole word with dashes in between. We're going to change it to linear. Now this is going to allow the animation to run smoothly on a general path without any interruptions. Okay, so now if we open up the live preview in brackets, or if you just open your HTML file in an editor, in a web browser rather, we can go and see how it's looking. Now it's just going to be an HTML document like this. You might have some scroll bars, you might not. Now both these things can be fixed by changing the overflow tags, but we're going to change them later. The way we used it on the Twisted Core site was the fact that the page was never going to be larger than the width of a browser. It was always going to be the same size, so that there was no need for any overflows or any scrolling. You can use this on your site, or you can choose to just have the bubbles appear at the bottom and flow up, and you might be able to scroll past them. If that's not a problem for you, then by all means leave the scroll bars in, but we'll remove them later in this project. Okay, so now we're going to start styling the individual bubbles themselves. So you're going to target them with a bubbles, Lee, and then we're going to do nth child. We're going to address the first one here. This is the very first bubble. I'm going to show you how we're going to start styling it. Now, first of all, we need to give it a width. So let's use 40 pixels for our first bubble. Now remember, since we've set the bottom to negative 100 pixels, all of these bubbles have to be 100 pixels or less. So since it's a square, we're going to have height 40 pixels as well. Okay, and we're also going to adjust how far they're offset. Now, since we've only got 5, we're going to space them quite evenly at 20% intervals. So on the left-hand side, we're going to bump it over by 20%. Now this just changes where the bubble is positioned on the screen when it starts. Sorry, 20%, not 20 pixels. Now this just changed where the bubble is placed on the screen, and you just do that. Now this animation is going to start as soon as the page is loaded, and that's fine for the first bubble, but we'll maybe change that up in the next bubbles. So we're going to copy this down, and we're going to create another bubbles targeting the second child. We're going to adjust the width to 60 pixels, for example, and we're going to push it over to 40% on the screen. Now for this one, we're going to maybe change at what speed, at what time rather, the bubble starts moving. Now in this bubble, with these two bubbles right now, the bubbles are going to start at exactly the same point. Now they may start at different positions on the screen, but they're both going to start moving at the same time. So we're going to change two properties here. The first one we're going to change is a property called animation delay, and that does exactly what it says on the tin. Animation delay simply offsets the amount of time before an animation begins, and for this one we're going to use 2 seconds. We're also going to change how long the animation is going to run. We're going to change the animation duration. I'm going to change that to less than 20 seconds. We're going to make it 17 seconds, for example. Now this means that the animation is going to be finished a lot faster, and so it will give the illusion that the bubble is moving a lot quicker than the bubble to the left. Okay, and then we're going to move on and to create the third bubble, and the third bubble we're going to set the width to simply a very small 10 pixels for a bit of randomization when we're going along here, and we're going to put that at 60%. Now we're going to change the animation delay on this one to something a bit higher, so that it goes in a sort of, you know, the first child, the second child, then the third child, and a diagonal step here. And we're going to make this animation duration a lot shorter. We're going to make this animation only go for 13 seconds, so the smaller bubble appears to be going a little bit faster here. Right, and then we'll move on to the fourth child, and it just goes on like this for how many you've chosen. And since we're doing 4, I'll just walk you through all the different ways you can customize each one. So we're going to make this one 80 pixels. What have I done here? 60%, I realised I missed something out there. And 80% for this bubble. Now the animation delay for this, we're going to remove that. In fact, we might just make it 1 second so it's slightly offset. And the animation duration will maybe bump up to 22 seconds, and we're going to make this the largest bubble so it'll move quite slowly. Now when you put your final bubble out here, number 5 in our example, we're going to make it even 50 pixels by 50 pixels. And we're going to put it somewhere in the middle, let's put it at 30%. Or in fact we can even put it more smack bang in the middle with 50%. And this will just be in between the third and second bubble. There is animation delay, so we'll make that a little bit longer. We'll make it a 7-second animation delay, and we'll make its animation duration 12 seconds for this example. Okay, so now to actually style the animation itself. Now we're going to be using keyframes for this. Now you put in an @ and then you type keyframes, and we're going to give it the name square because we've already addressed it in our previous animation tag. We've already called the animation square. So simply we're going to have 2 states. We're going to have a 0% state, and we're also going to have a 100% state. Now both these states, this is just showing where the animation will start, this is how it's going to start, and this is how it's going to end. So at the start of the animation, we're going to be having a transform, and it's going to be a translate Y here. And the translate Y is just how the object is translated across the y-axis, so how far up and down it is. And for this one it's going to be translated 0, so it's going to remain at its original state in its first tag, which is minus 120 pixels. But by the end of the animation, we want a transform, translate Y once again, but we want it to be been translated. Now this is an arbitrary amount, but for this example I'm going to be using 800 pixels because I'd like the animation to move 800 pixels up. But you can choose whatever amount you like. 800 pixels will cover most screens, but if you want to maybe bump it up for a larger monitor, for example the monitor I'm using is a 1080p monitor, so we can bump it up to 1080p to show the effects on specifically this monitor. But this is how far the object will move from the bottom of the screen to the top of the screen. So we'll use that by 1080 pixels there. We also, since it's bubbles, we'd like them to spin around in the air. So we're going to put them as a rotate, and we're going to choose 630 degrees so we can get a crazy spinning transition as we go up. Okay, now that is the basis of the whole animation complete. One thing we're going to want to remember is that when we're using these, to ensure browser cross-compatibility, we want to make sure that we can access them across a lot of different browsers. For example, we want to prefix WebKit tags to a lot of these. So things like the transitions are always going to want WebKit tags in front of them. Now, the WebKit tag allows browsers that use a WebKit engine such as Safari to correctly interpret the animations. You have to add a WebKit onto animations like transform and the translate Y, and onto the animation delay and the animation duration. Don't worry, this will all be in the source code download with the full prefixes added to all of them, so you don't need to worry about adding them yourself. But just as a general rule of thumb, if it uses transforms, if it uses animations, or it uses transitions, you always want to prefix it with WebKit, -moz, -ie, -ns for the different browsers that will be accessing your site. Okay, so now you're going to want to start seeing your animation. Now, the animation is actually running here, but because we've set the bubbles to white squares with opacity, we can't actually see them running on the screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to target the body class, or the body element rather. We're going to set its background color to black. We're also going to set its z-index to 1, so you cannot interact with the elements behind it. So now that's done, we can open up our browser, we give it a refresh here, and you should be able to start seeing the bubbles floating across the screen. And it's as simple as that. That is the bubble animation finished. Now you can target all these bubbles individually, and you can add more, you can add as many as you like. All you have to remember is as you add more, increase the amount of lees you've got here. So if you add a 6th bubble lee here, make sure you've got 6 lees in this here. Now, the animation will repeat constantly, and because of the different timings, the bubbles will appear to be coming out at random times. Now, one thing that you might not like is the scroll bars at the side, and as I mentioned, they're easy to remove. Now, if you want to just have a simple landing page and you're not worried about people having to scroll on your site, you can add the classes overflow y hidden and overflow x hidden, and that will remove the scroll bars from the flow of the document. So now the page is a simple size like this. There's no scroll bars, there's nothing in the way, and you've simply got your bubbles going here. So thanks very much for watching this tutorial. As I mentioned before, the source code is in the description if you'd like to implement this into your own project. Remember to leave a like if you like this video and subscribe if you'd like to see even more tutorials from Twisted Core.